We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website, bookedonrock.com. So here I am, 2.5 years into the start of COVID, and I finally got it. Wednesday, I'm recording this on Saturday, November 5th. So Wednesday, I tested positive. And I've been just stuck in this apartment since Wednesday afternoon. It's been a blast. So yeah, I've been just hanging out, doing a lot of writing. I think if you go to the Van Halen news desk, you're going to notice there are quite a few articles there with my byline on it, because I've had some extra time to do that. We're working on the podcast, doing a lot of reading, of course, getting ready for some upcoming interviews, including this one today, Michael Tao. And I wasn't sure, can I keep this interview scheduled? I mean, how am I going to feel? But I'm fine. Just a little tired. No big deal. I'm still here. I'm still standing, quoting the great Elton John. Which reminds me, by the way, tonight, this is Saturday, November 5th that I'm recording this. Tonight, 9 p.m., I'll be on And the Podcast Will Rock's live YouTube show. Very exciting. We're going to talk some Van Halen. So by the time you hear this, it's going to be already up on YouTube. And the Podcast Will Rock. They've got a YouTube channel. Just look for it, and you'll see my mug on there talking about my band, Van Halen. All right, so now on to the show. Our guest is author Michael Tao. The book is called Extreme Music from Silence to Noise and Everything in Between. Michael Tao had spent years obsessed by the extremes of musical expression. And extreme music is the culmination of decades of research into the sounds and silences that comprise the outer limits and conceptual expressions that stretch the definition of music. Tao defines and categorizes these recorded sounds into sections that allow fans and newcomers to explore the fascinating world of musicians who defy convention. He explores a wide range of extremes, including volume, speed, and vulgarity, to packaging, recording methods, unplayable media, outdated technologies, and digital pioneers. He asks and answers the questions: are all sounds music? Is silence music? Does a plate of rotting food, once cataloged, packaged, and sold by a distributor, qualify as music? Extreme Music includes over 100 interviews with makers and musicians, as Michael uses his background in psychiatry to help readers understand what motivates people to create and listen to non-mainstream music. As a fan of multiple avant-garde musical genres, Michael uncovers the pleasures and sometimes pain and frustration found at the outré fringes of music. Extreme Music is the ideal guide for curious seekers, diehard fans, and cultural investigators. To hear the songs and the sounds discussed in this episode, head over to the show notes page. Most of them we found on Spotify, but not all of them, and we're able to track those down through YouTube and other sources, so we've got links to those as well on the show notes page. All right, let's talk to Michael Tao. Michael, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the book, I want to know what led you to writing this book, because this is an interesting topic that you get into. You are a psychiatrist by day?
That's true, yes. The book goes back a fair way when I was still a resident, so doing my training in psychiatry. And I've always, I've had a long-standing interest in music, and particularly some of the more esoteric and unusual forms of music, noise music, experimental music. But after many years of, writing reviews, doing interviews, things like that, I started on a project to put together this book, which I would do kind of, in the evenings and the weekends when I was doing my residency during the day and finding time whenever I could. And then gradually, I reached out to people, conducted interviews, and slowly put it together. And then right after I finished residency, I took a bit of time to finish it off, and then I submitted it to publishers, and here we are.
Yeah, well, the purpose of the book, as you write, is to look at musical and quasi-musical moments and try to understand them. And there are 7 sections in the book. Extreme scenes, extreme durations, extreme records, technological quirks, extreme packaging, recordings with a question mark, and the digital age. You say there are several music scenes that emphasize loudness. I want to ask you about the loudness war. This is a name given to a phenomenon in which recording engineers manipulate the sonic parameters of a recording to make it sound louder. Sound engineers use a method called dynamic range compression. Metallica and the Red Hot Chili Peppers are a couple of bands who've used this method. What is a dynamic range compression, and how did fans of these bands respond to this method when they first heard it?
So this is interestingly a bit of a controversy amongst audiophiles and even fans of the bands that you mentioned. So it's this idea that early on in recording engineers were producing fairly accurate replicas of the music that was performed. As time has gone on, there have been processes that have been used to change the sound of music, and in particular to make it sound better on the radio, to make it stick out more when you hear it, compared against other songs. So dynamic range compression is this process where instead of having a broad set of dynamics in the recording, where if you're recording something accurately, the drums are going to be a lot louder than the guitar and the vocals, but they'll be, very short, each drum hit. So the process that was developed essentially took the middle range and expanded it so that everything sounds louder, crisper. When you listen to it on the radio, it pops more. And I think that helps, when people are listening to the radio in the car, for example, it helps it come through better when it's up against the noise of, the tires against the road. Why this is controversial is a lot of people feel like it's not, an accurate representation of the music itself. But B, there's this idea that by listening to this highly compressed music, it would cause ear fatigue. So it'd be, exhausting on the ear, cause ear pain, and that would become irritating over time. The loudness war was the idea that recording engineers were continuously adding more and more compression in order to get music to pop more, to be more successful. But people were finding that the product was irritating, causing ear fatigue. Interestingly, in the chapter, I dug into some of the academic research on this topic, like academic journals about recording. And so there's some controversy about whether dynamic range compression does in fact cause ear fatigue, as well as whether or not the dynamics of the sound are truly being lost in this process. So this was one approach I took to explore the idea of music getting louder and louder. What does that mean? What is that extreme?
So Metallica and Red Hot Chili Peppers, that was early 2000s, I believe, is when they were doing this, right?
Yeah.
This is, I'm trying to remember the Metallica album.
Death Magnetic.
It's Death Magnetic.
Yeah.
So this is interesting because I remember at that time when I would download MP3s onto my computer, you noticed there was a definite difference in what you're seeing. It was like a block across the screen. And
Yes.
I think that's what you're talking about, right? There's no, like if you would take, like if you had an older recording, or even like if you took a vinyl record and you had the ability to transfer it on to a computer and convert it to MP3, you would see a lot of up and downs, and it would be in a lot of nice space there in between the lines.
But instead, it's one block of sound.
It's one block, and that would the ear fatigue is interesting because I always thought, man, it's just too. It sounds like it's all just one sound. It didn't sound right. So that was actually an actual technique that they were they used to try to get people, I guess, to try to have these songs stand out among the others on the radio.
I think so. I mean, I think at that time the radio would have been one of the more primary ways people were listening to music. And I do think when you put everything up at the max and you make the top of the drum hits equal to the other aspects of the sound, the guitar, the vocals, etc., it's easier to hear the music. It's easier to hear the melody. It's easier to hear the vocals. And so if you're in an otherwise noisy setting, you're going to be able to hear it much more clearly than you might hear, like you say, a record from the 50s that wasn't recorded in that way.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, Lou Reed was somebody fascinated with sound and noise. I remember listening to an interview with him where he just talked about how fascinated he was with sounds and noise and how you can make music out of it. His 1975 double album, Metal Machine Music, is considered a seminal event in noise. What is it that he did on that album, and why did it become so controversial?
The story is that he was at the end of his recording contract with his record label and wasn't very happy. And so he put together this extremely unmarketable double album that was essentially feedback noise from the guitar. And it's considered a seminal moment in the history of noise music because it was sort of a prominent artist creating this noisy work that, certainly would have not been the norm for popular music at the time. Although, in fairness, there were many, experimental composers and other people who explored noise before him. But this one was sort of it grazing the popular culture. Predictably, the record did not sell well, but it does represent this prominent moment in noise music history that a lot of people have made reference to since.
New Age is the most commercially viable of all the forms of quiet music. To cynics, New Age is a marketing term. It's made some record labels very wealthy, but you say there is a fascinating underworld of lesser known New Age works. What are some of those?
I don't know about you, but when I think of New Age, I think of music from the 90s.
Enya?
Enya, yeah. Or that stuff, there'd be like kiosks in pharmacies and grocery stores with nature sounds. And Yanni, I guess, would be another key touchstone, sort of mystical, droney music. And I guess like every scene, there's the popular stuff. And then there's the stuff that, didn't hit the mainstream, stuff that was self-released often or put out on small labels, but adhere to this New Age aesthetic. And some of that stuff is really interesting, right? Because, Yanni, Enya, whatever, Yanni has a bit of a cult of character, I think, but they're fine. There's nothing overtly abnormal. But some of the more obscure New Age stuff has this crossover with, like new religious movements and cults. So you have these weird tapes and records that came out in small editions with either they'd make strange claims that the music could heal, etc., or they'd be directly related to some form of unusual religious movement. Some of this stuff has actually become quite collectible. There are a group of collectors who are interested in archiving this music.
I was going to say hard to find, right?
Yeah, like, some of these things would have been put out in 200 copies, right? So how many of those are going to survive the test of time?
There's a section on extreme durations, and this is fascinating. Can you talk about this American conceptual band, Bull of Heaven, and their extremely long album, Like a Wall in Which an Insect Lives and Gnaws? What is this album?
This is an album that's 5.7 years long, which would take quite some time to listen to in full.
Yeah, you have to be able to listen to it in like a commute to work.
Right. Yes.
You won't get to the
end. Lifetime of commutes. It's a 4 terabyte file, the MP3, just for reference. So, and that's not the longest composition that these people have made. They've made compositions that are multiple times longer than that. Yeah. So Bull of Heaven was a really interesting band or act that existed in the early 2000s. These two guys, Neil Keener and Clayton Counts. Unfortunately, Clayton Counts, who is kind of in some ways, the ideologue behind the band, he passed away several years ago, but I was fortunate to speak to Neil Keener. They did a lot of unusual conceptual things. They had a big, they would promote their music online and post it online. They also stirred a bit of controversy online because people would argue, like, how is this real music 5.7 years? There are other albums that were like, billions of years long that they made. They're obviously not recording this live. They're putting it together through, electronic methods.
And what is it we're hearing on it?
Yeah, so I can't say I've listened to it all. Some of it sounds a lot like drone music. There's a YouTube video where someone sort of like compiled a few different clips of the like quintillion years long album where you can listen to different parts of it. Some of it just sounds like a slow bass pulse. So we're talking about abstract music, not conventional pop songwriting, of course. For some of it, it's not even one file. It's essentially a program that you play, and then it will start playing, and it will go until it ends, which would be after the end of the universe, right?
What's amazing is that Bull of Heaven album wasn't the longest musical composition recorded up till then. And as far as what's been recorded since, there is one piece of music that was released midnight, December 31st, 1999, and it's still going. What's the story behind this piece called Long Player?
So Long Player was, it's definitely longer than that Bull of Heaven album, although Bull of Heaven have created longer ones. But that was a member of the Celtic punk group, the Pogues, Gemfiner. And so they created this, essentially this piece that is performed live, sort of it's set up on December 31st, 1999, and it's set to run until December 31st, 2999, 1,000 years. What it does is it takes this piece of music that's actually 20 minutes and 20 seconds long, created on Tibetan singing bowls, and then created 6 versions of that, each one either sped up or slowed down. So they're at different durations. And so the idea is that they all start playing at the same time, and then they'll gradually get, more and more out of line with one another, because each one is a different duration than the other. And then 1,000 years later, they'll all end up synchronized again.
Wow.
Right? That it'll take 1,000 years mathematically for that to happen. So that's a composition that will play out for 1,000 years, assuming, no one shuts it down. And you can visit it.
You can visit it. Where can we find it?
Trinity Buoy Wharf in London. And you can also listen via radio.
All right, guys, going to stop here. If you want to go and give that a listen, check it out. Just go to TRINITYBUOYWHARF.com. You can also find it on longplayer.org. Links to both those sites on our show notes page, too. So I would say give it a listen and then come back, but that's impossible. All right, back to the interview. And it's set to conclude on December 31st, 2999.
Yes, I'll see you there.
Yeah, that is just, that's commitment to something. That's the one thing that's interesting about all of these artists. This isn't a financial benefit to them. This is just something they really feel creatively inspired to do.
On the face of it, it comes off as a novelty, but in reality, this is exploring a compositional technique that I think is really conceptually interesting. And Gemfiner is not the only person to do this thing where it's using loops of sound that are different durations and then having them play out. I think it's a fascinating way of exploring, what makes a composition. What if a composition is longer than the lifespan of, anyone who could listen to it? It's a fascinating idea that a lot of these different artists are putting together.
Michael Tao is our guest to talk about his new book, Extreme Music, From Silence to Noise and Everything in Between. The section of the book on extreme records explores the physical release of music, and in 2014, the Eagles were the subject of an extreme record story that made headlines. What happened there?
This chapter shifts from the audio to looking at, the actual format. And in this particular chapter, it's looking at large records. I kicked it off with something that really is more of a novelty than anything else. The Eagles created this very large physical record that was, if I recall correctly, and I'm worried I'm not doing justice to this, but it was on the roof of a building.
The LA Forum, wasn't it?
Yes.
I think
yes.
the LA Forum, yeah.
It was a over 4,000 inch record on top of an arena in California. It could rotate very slowly. So in theory, it was the biggest record ever created, although I don't believe it had grooves that could be played. But it was this, I would imagine, extremely expensive structure that was created and could be considered the largest record ever made.
I remember that well. I remember seeing that on the web. That got them some headlines. A great promotional tool. Right. There's something with financial gain to it. That's going to get your attention. And they were on tour, and that was a great way to sell tickets. Not that the Eagles really needed help with that, but yeah. Records have come in many different sizes and shapes. Record companies have come up with some innovative ways to promote a record, just like I was saying with the Eagles there. Can you talk about the label from the late 40s called Voco?
The Voco label was this record label in the 1940s. It was a children's music label, and they put together a bunch of pleasant novelty records for children. What was interesting about them is that the records were shaped unusually, and they were picture discs. So the versions that I've seen have all been cute animals in human clothing. The picture that's in the book is a bunny rabbit wearing a top hat. He's the ringmaster of the circus. This was interesting because it was one of the early examples of records that were shaped, not just in a circle. There were some earlier ones, some obscure earlier ones that were postcard records, but this one was more sort of whimsical and fanciful. And as far as I know, the first example of, non-circular records that weren't just postcard records.
Some really cool releases like records that melt, records made of ice, glue, and there is the buzzsaw single. As far as you can tell, the first truly buzzsaw-shaped record came out in 1986. The thrash metal band from California, Dark Angel, is the first to do so. The band Wasp also did something similar that year. What did they do?
Yeah, so they created another shaped picture disc. It wasn't in the shape of a buzzsaw, but it was a picture disc of a man wearing a thong with a circular blade, and it was shaped kind of like following the outline of the man's pelvis. So kind of an early variant of the buzzsaw shape. And interestingly, that buzzsaw shape, a circular record with the blades around it, like you would see on a buzzsaw. That's something that after 1986, many different artists created versions of. And I just sort of find it fascinating how ideas like this, someone comes up with it and then it sticks. And then you have all of these other records that use this, including a record label that produced a whole series of saw blade or buzzsaw type records. I had a chance to interview the person who ran that record label. Very much like the buzzsaw, it was quite a rigmarole creating a system that could create these records. It's basically stamping them, and apparently very dangerous to create these records because it involves so many sharp edges. People can get cut and hurt. But what they did was this was a German label who would put singles out on buzzsaw records that would match punk bands like the Circle Jerks, White Flag, and license the flip side of the record to be famous artists like Alice Cooper, Cher, even Frank Sinatra. So you'd have these weird saw blade records that would have a punk band on the side and then Frank Sinatra on the other.
On the other side.
Yeah.
Who isn't a fan of Miles Davis, Kind of Blue? That's a question that obviously doesn't need to be asked. But what about Kind of Bloop? What is the story behind this unusual album from 2009? And what makes it so unusual?
So chiptune or 8-bit music, this is a subgenre of music where artists are creating music that is made to resemble early video game music. So, bloops and bleeps and the 8-bit sound of, Nintendo or ColecoVision or Super Nintendo. Back in 2009, someone created a record that was a note-for-note remake of Kind of Blue, the excellent Miles Davis album that you and I love. It was all done properly. I believe the songs were all licensed properly. It was freely available, but the cover of it was like a pixelized digital art version of the cover for Kind of Blue. And the photographer who shot the original photo for Miles Davis's album was upset because I guess they hadn't gotten the rights for that. So they ended up suing the person who created Kind of Bloop, and he ended up having to pay over $30,000 and agree not to use the image again. So it was sort of a disappointing and unfortunate moment, I'm sure, for that person.
30 grand. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine if they were even able to make that money back on sales of the
And I think it was, if I recall correctly, I think it was freely available, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like this was not a money-making proposition.
Wow. Okay.
But, I guess perhaps it's easier to license the rights to the songwriting than it is to the cover art. I don't know.
Well, our younger listeners may not know what an 8-track is. And trust me, guys, you're not missing out. What was an 8-track cassette? Why was it created? And how did it become a collector's item in the late 80s and 90s?
Yeah. So in fairness, I wasn't really around during the 8-track era. So I think, Eric, you might be better able to.
As a little kid, I remember my older brother had Jay Giles' band Centerfold and a Kansas album, I believe. Maybe even Toto, too. Yeah, they were clunky.
So why did you hate them so much? Some people love them.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't rewind. You had to go from, you can only skip forward.
Right.
So you had to go all the way. It's like if you wanted to hear the track 2 and you were, say, on track 4, you had to go all the way to the end.
Right.
Go back around to the start, skip over 1 and then get to 2, right? I mean, that's what I remember about it.
Yeah. And I know that they were also famous for butchering classic albums because unlike a tape where you've got 2 sides, the 8-track has more than two, so they'd end up having to cut up the records to make the songs fit on each side, and they'd have to reorder the songs. And so, yeah, quite controversial, popular amongst certain people. Apparently, there's rumors that some of them are still created for the trucking industry, but only rumors. So I guess, like anything, some people have a fondness for remembering 8-tracks, even if they were clunky and inconvenient. And so there are groups of people who either collect old 8-track records. There's 8-track museums. There used to be a zine that ran for many years that documented the collecting of 8-tracks. But now there's also people who are reviving the 8-track format and releasing new music on 8-track. And to do that, what they're doing is they're finding old 8-track cassettes, and they're essentially repairing them, cutting them open for parts, all in the service of creating new 8-tracks using old materials. So some of this is on the underground music scene, but it's caught enough attention that some major record labels and bands have even commissioned people to create this. So I know, if you remember the band Tesla did one for a record that they put out a few years ago. They commissioned a limited edition of 8-track versions, and then a bunch of other bands as well.
I have to ask you to share the story of Tooth Tunes with listeners, because this is in the chapter on non-traditional formats, a musical experience while you brush your teeth. And there was a band who recorded a song specifically for it. Yeah.
So I'll say that before I talk, I couldn't resist with Tooth Tunes because it's sort of this fun thing, although it's a bit of an anomaly in the section on technological quirks, because a lot of what I'm doing is looking at how people have revived these old formats and the kind of cottage industries and little worlds that have been created, exploring, people's shared affinity for old formats or unusual formats like microcassettes, floppy disks. These are formats that people are actively putting music out on these formats. But Tooth Tunes is a bit of an anomaly, right? Tooth Tunes was a partnership between a toy company and a toothbrush company. And they were electric toothbrushes that would, when you put them on your tooth and brushed, they would transmit vibrations to your teeth, which would go to your jawbone, which would then go into your ear. And you would therefore hear, songs, short little songs. And we encourage children to brush their teeth. So Devo created a version of Whip It called Brush It. And that was their tooth tune. And I don't know what child would, in 2007 would have wanted to listen to Devo, but I love Devo, and
Yeah.
but I don't know if that was
funny.
What they would have wanted to listen to, but I guess they commissioned Devo to create this version.
That's great. So section 5 is titled Extreme Packaging. This is some interesting stuff here. The band The Residents, their 2012 box set was packaged in a full-size refrigerator. In 1981, German minimal wave artist John Bender's Plaster Falling album arrived in a sleeve dipped in white plaster. To get the record out, there was a string embedded in the plaster that had to be pulled, causing the case to crumble apart. There are scented records, some with pleasant scents, some with not so pleasant scents. And there was an artist who released a mini CD with dog feces enclosed within. Can you talk about some of the other interesting releases? So many that you include in the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I got to ask you about the one from Merzbow too. That's
the Merzbow record. Yeah. Or the Merz car. Yeah. So, I mean, I find this stuff very interesting as someone with a long affinity for experimental music, noise, underground music. It's interesting how the idea that, started with major labels would be to create kind of gimmicky records, right? Like an Alice Cooper record that came with the panties inside of it, or the famous Rolling Stones Sticky Fingers album where you have the zipper you could pull down, right? These gimmicks that were meant to sell records. In the world of underground music, there would be a lot of even more intense or extreme exploration of this idea of creating novel packaging ideas, often very homemade in nature, right? So you cited a couple of those. There's the famous dog feces record. There's the CDR, a CDR release that's a bit of a centerpiece of my book, where it was shipped to people, this record, inside a box of cooked pasta with pesto, So by the time it would arrive in people's mailboxes, it would be rancid, right? So these kind of handmade packaging ideas were and continue to be a big thing on in certain underground music scenes. And I had the opportunity to interview a number of different people to explore kind of the origins of this idea, what makes it compelling to people. There are some famous labels like MSBR Records or American Tapes that really did a lot of work in this area. There was the famous MSBR record that came in a package that's made of chocolate. I don't think any of those have survived the test of time, unfortunately.
No. So what's the one with the Merz car?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So I guess that's almost like the pièce de résistance of this idea, which, if I'm remembering it correctly, the record label owner had a car that they no longer needed, no longer wanted. And so in an effort to get rid of it, they put their new Merzbow album cassette inside the stereo and damaged the stereo such that it couldn't be removed. And I think that it couldn't be turned off. And Merzbow is a Japanese noise musician, so it was a harsh noise cassette. And so then offered this up for sale as a limited edition, one copy only release in this very unique packaging of a car that you can't turn the stereo off and it's playing harsh noise. And I don't think anyone bought it. I think he ended up having to junk the car.
Was a cardboard box covered in concrete on one? One came in a custom ceramic pot garnished with bird feathers from the shores of the Irish Sea. A single with shards of broken glass glued to it. There's a good one.
Right. Yeah. Another dangerous, like
handle with care. Yeah. Now let's get to the section that explores silence, section 6. This reminds me of a scene in there's a Robert Redford movie, The Natural. You know the movie The Natural, the baseball movie?
Mm-hmm.
There's a scene where he's a baseball player. He goes into the team owner's office and all the lights are out. And he says to the owner, "The only thing I know about the dark is you can't see it." And then the owner responds by saying, "That's a lie. You can still see everything. It's dark, but it's not completely dark." And most people perceive still environment as silence, but not so, says the funk band Wolfpack. Can you talk about the definition of silence and the Wolfpack album called Sleepify?
So when people think of silent music, often they think of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which was the famous performance where he went in front of a concert audience, sat at the piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It didn't play anything. And then the central concept is the sound was not the absence of piano sound. The sound was, the people shuffling their feet and flipping through their programs, all of the other incidental sounds that occurred in the concert hall. So this touches at the idea that even if you put yourself in like a sensory isolation tank and try to eliminate all audio, all sound, all vibrations that hit your ear, you're still going to hear, you might just be hearing kind of the hisses and the buzzes of your auditory system, right? The mild tinnitus, all of these things. It's the idea of being in an environment where you get literally no sonic input going through your brain. It's impossible to conceive. So that idea has coursed through a lot of the silent compositions and silent records that have been produced. You cited this Wolfpack record, Sleepify, which was a bit of it's sort of a different concept. Essentially, they created a silent album, which people were supposed to play on Spotify, just put it on overnight and then have it play. And each track on this album was just the right amount of length to trigger the Spotify requirement for them to get paid, right? So 30 seconds, after 30 seconds, then they send you the like 100th of a cent that you get. But, if enough fans of the band were playing this album all night, it added up to being a substantial amount of money. So the record was created to kind of circumvent this streaming mechanism, not as a like true money-making enterprise, but I think more of as a sort of, cynical comment about streaming music and how it affects artists. So they ended up earning tons of money because people were playing this record. And then Spotify, said, "This isn't fair. We're not going to send you the check." I think it was $20,000 that they'd earned. And then it became a rigmarole. There was some media attention involved. And eventually Spotify did pay it out.
Wow. You finished the book with a section on the digital age. There is a genre called vaporwave. We've all heard songs which include sampling. Many rap and hip-hop artists have sampled classic rock tracks to great success, as we know. Vaporwave artists take these samples and they create a nostalgic approach.
Yeah, I think the term is nostalgia for the imagined past. So nostalgia for, a time period that the people might not have actually experienced. I think vaporwave, it's a really interesting genre, largely one that takes place online. To me, it's another example of a concept that in some ways is very pure, even extreme, that people have really explored in incredible detail. So just to sort of make this a bit clearer, so there's this subgenre of vaporwave, which I talk quite a bit about, called mallsoft. And the idea behind mallsoft is it's music that's supposed to conjure the experience of walking through a mall in like the 80s or the 90s.
Yes, this is fascinating too. Yeah. Hantazi is one too, right?
And Hantazi is one of the people who created one of the seminal mallsoft records. But what's interesting is a lot of the people who are the producers of this type of music, they're too young to have really been in their past exposed to malls in the 80s and the 90s. Like a lot of them are, in their early 20 somethings, which is not to say maybe, when they were very young, they would have gone through malls, but it would have been a different experience than the one that they're trying to conjure up, which is why it's this great example of nostalgia for an imagined past. So they have probably cultural touchstones, old movies and things where they've seen malls. And this music I think very cleverly conjures this feeling of walking through a mall. Sometimes it's like walking through an abandoned mall. And sometimes it's like walking through a mall, in 1994. It's just, there'll be samples of smooth jazz or other forms of elevator or light music. And often they'll also have, the sound of voices in the background echoing off the walls of the mall. So I find it actually, it's very fun. It's very relaxing actually to listen to.
It goes to show there's just so many different ways that you can experiment with sounds and lack of sound too, as you point out in the book. It's such an interesting read. Extreme music from silence to noise and everything in between. This is out now through Feral House Books.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you online, Michael?
The book is available through all of the major retailers. It can be purchased on bookshop.org or Amazon or likely your local bookstore. There is a website for it. If you Google extreme music, Michael Tao, you'll find it on the Feral House website. I do run a website as well called Anomaly Index, ANOMALY index.com, where essentially what it is I take deeper dives into some specific records and things sort of similar to the ones that I cover in the book. So it's just an opportunity to go more in depth about certain specific unusual records or artists or things like that.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'll put links to both on the show notes page so listeners can go right there and click the link and check it out.
Thanks so much.
Michael, this was great, man. Thanks for being on the podcast and for enlightening us on some interesting areas of music.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you as always for listening. That'll do it for this episode. I'm Eric Senich. Don't forget to check out And the Podcast Will Rock's YouTube channel. I'll be a guest on there tonight, so by the time you hear this, it's already up. Big thanks to Mark and Corey for having me on their excellent podcast, all about the mighty Van Halen. Hope to have you back again for the next episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.